I'm very glad to introduce now Daniele Bruzzone to you. And Daniele, he is a full professor of general and social pedagogy at the Department of Education at the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart, Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milano. He is a coordinator of the MA degree there in coordination of childhood and youth services, the scientific director of the advanced training course Meaning and Quality of Health Care. He is interested in his research topics, philosophy of education in existential and phenomenological perspective, phenomenology of emotion, self-care and education, healthcare and social work, and search for meaning, resilience and growth processes in adolescence and life transitions. His publications is one in our edition of Phenomenological Educational Science, Emotional Life, Phenomenology, Education and Care from the year 2023. And he's the editor-in-chief of the journal Encyclopedia, the Journal of Phenomenology and Education in Italy. I'm very happy that you join us here, and we are really curious on your presentation. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Sorry for almost interrupting your lunch pause, but this is life, you know. And let me first of all thank my friend Professor Brinkmann for once again giving us the opportunity to have this space for interchange, for reflection, for learning and for personal growth. Thank you very much. And thank all of you for the contributions you will give to the realization of this important event. In recent years, I have been working on adolescence, and when I read the call for papers of this conference, I thought that the topic worldliness and relation to the world was extremely relevant to what I was experiencing with teenagers. Adolescence has always appeared as a mysterious and disturbing, in a way, phenomenon. Each new generation seems to be an undecipherable enigma, so much so that teenagers has often been defined more by what they are not, what they are no longer, or what they are not yet, than by what they actually are. I believe that this lack of understanding lays in our inability to get into their worldview, and above all in the unwillingness sometimes to question our own worldview. In the past, intergenerational conflicts resulted from this incongruence between different and even opposing experiences of the world. Today, I feel that these worlds are much more closer to one another, perhaps too close to each other, to the point of becoming dangerously confused. What I mean is that their experience of the world and ours are no longer so different and strangers to each other. This should facilitate mutual understanding, but as a matter of fact, being immersed in the same condition, albeit in different ways, makes it difficult for both sides to pull themselves out of it. So we share a similar condition, but we lose any educational asymmetry and our capacity to help them sometimes. The phenomenon of anxiety is emblematic, in my opinion, as it affects young people and adults alike, but at the same time raises some radical questions that, as educators, we cannot underestimate. I will attempt to analyze it in the light of existential phenomenology and outline some very concrete educational implications. In contemporary society of risk and uncertainty, there is an increase in the perception of precariousness and threat. The predominant emotion of fear and its social implications have been emblematically outlined by prominent researchers as Ulrich Beck, Zygmunt Bauman, and so on. But fear is rapidly evolving into an epidemic of anxiety. Anxiety, in the broader and deeper sense of the term, is not only an emotional response to stressful situations or potentially dangerous events, which would be totally understandable, but an indefinite, pervasive feeling with important existential implications. After the pandemic, epidemiological surveys recorded an increase of psychological distress and mental disorders among young people. Last year, the Italian Authority for Children and Adolescents found that 51% of a sample of 7,500 secondary school students suffered from recurrent and prolonged anxiety and sadness. Emotional distress sometimes reaches psychopathological levels. In 2021, UNICEF had already found that 8% of European girls and boys between the age of 10 and 19 suffer from diagnosed anxiety disorder. As you can see in this graph, girls seem to be affected to a significantly greater extent. In a recent book that provoked heated scientific debate, Jonathan Haidt refers to the teenagers of our time as the anxious generation. I will skip over his positions regarding the correlation between the use of smartphones and social media and the increase of anxiety and other disorders, but I will keep the title of this book as a good reason to look into the nature of anxiety and the experience of the world that it discloses or precludes. Now, when coming to anxiety, what we need is first of all a terminology clarification. From a linguistic point of view, the German Angst can be understood as anguish or anxiety. The term used by Kierkegaard and later by Heidegger has been translated preferably into English as anxiety. Although in French, for example, Sartre and Lacan preferred to use angoisse rather than anxiété. In Italian too, the philosophical word is usually angoscia and not ansia. However, in English, I will stick to the term anxiety, even though this word is also used in a clinical sense. According to the DSM-5, there are 7 anxiety disorders, which, by the way, are the most common disorders among Western population. But this coincidence of terms is not necessarily a bad thing, as it allows us to link philosophical and ontological reflection with the psychological and psychiatric discourse on anxiety. So I think that the first issue we must address is the relationship between our emotional states and the world we live in. From a phenomenological point of view, the world is never objective or neutral. It appears to us within an emotional framework that makes possible for us to grasp its meaning and values. The givenness of concrete objects is preceded by a sort of emotional openness or disposition, which has mostly been called Stimmung or mood. In his book, Das Wesen der Stimmungen, which I translated into Italian many years ago, Otto Bollnow said that elevated or depressed moods are particular attunements with oneself, the others, and the world as a whole. Stimmung, says Bollnow, pervades the whole person from the lower to the higher strata and gives all his emotions a certain characteristic coloring. This fundamental feeling, therefore, has the power to make possible certain emotions rather than others. Psychiatrist Paul Schroeder in 1930 wrote, "Stimmung is the framework of psychic facts within which only certain groups of feelings and certain directions of feeling are possible." Not only feelings, for sure. From this particular emotional attunement, all other acts of thinking, willing, and acting arise. As Heidegger says, I quote, "Being in the state of feeling is the original dimension of which thinking and willing are a part." According to the new phenomenology by Schmitz, Werner, and others, these moods are part of the environment and should be conceived as emotional atmospheres which surround us. Each atmosphere has its own authority, since it has the power to disclose or preclude certain possibilities, so that atmospheres determine our relationships to ourselves, the others, and the world. Anyway, what moods and atmospheres affect is not the world in itself, which in any case is out of reach, but the world for us, namely the world as we experience it, the world towards which we are intentionally directed, the world as it calls to our attention, the world to which we respond in one way or another. I tried to make clear this relationship between mood, atmospheres, and the world we live in my book on emotional life that Malte kindly received in his collection. Thank you again. Now, anxiety essentially regards the self in relation to the world. In 1844, Kierkegaard wrote that anxiety reveals our freedom to us. Anxiety is defined as freedom's disclosure to itself in possibility. Quotation. So, anxiety is the awareness that our existence depends on ourselves, that we are responsible for the way things will turn out, and that our freedom implies a radical responsibility. And as we know, this feeling can lead to a dramatic divide between faith and despair. Now, if by despair we mean a state of resignation, alienation, and disengagement from reality, then we can assimilate it to apathy or depression. And it is not coincidence that there is a certain comorbidity between anxiety and depressive symptoms. This is why Kierkegaard says that the experience of anxiety is fundamentally ambivalent. We love it as we love our freedom, but we try to avoid it as we try to avoid our responsibility. Because responsibility refers us back to ourselves and our adequacy or inadequacy. Those who suffer from anxiety are not necessarily incapable of dealing with situations or obstacles that may arise, but they fear that they are. So anxiety is essentially concerns oneself in relation to the world. To deal with it, one must be strong and resilient enough to tolerate the possibility of error, failure, disappointment, suffering, that are always involved as eventualities in the pursuit of success, fulfillment, and satisfaction. Lack of self-esteem and low tolerance for frustration throw us into anxiety and a sort of existential paralysis, since trying is useless if you believe you will fail. That's exactly what is happening to many of our kids nowadays. Heidegger, too, believed that anxiety reveals the ontological structure of Dasein as possibility. That's why he considers it a fundamental mood, the Grundstimmung. As you remember, in Being in Time, chapter 5, Heidegger distinguishes between fear, Furcht, and anxiety, Angst, as two possible modes of Befindlichkeit. One as an emotion directed at a specific and determined object. Fear is always a fear of something, of some entity in front of us. The other as a mood that addresses the world as such. Anxiety does not know what that in the face of which it is anxious is. Jean-Paul Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, takes up this distinction, reiterating that fear concerns objects, while anxiety does not concern anything in particular, but it is a specific way of perceiving oneself in relation to the world. In a previous work, The Sketch for a Theory of the Emotions, Sartre stated that emotions produce a magical transformation of the world. According to this definition, we should understand what kind of transformation what kind of transformation of the world is provoked by anxiety. What kind of world project, Weltentwurf, is accessible or denied to a consciousness dominated by anxiety? The anxious existence is no longer capable of experiencing space and time as an open and promising horizon, for its main feature is closure. Anxiety induces defensive attitudes, interrupts interpersonal bonds, shortens our breath, narrows our gaze. In his latest book on hope and anxiety, Byung-Chul says that anxiety narrows the field of vision and blocks the view. Those who experience anxiety feel pushed into a bottleneck. Anxiety goes hand in hand with the feeling of being caught, imprisoned, locked up. In anxiety, the world appears to us as a prison. This interpretation has its etymological reason. The Latin word anxietas, from the verb angere, to tighten, to squeeze, and the word angustia, from angustus, which means narrow, indicate a feeling of breathlessness, of suffocation. This term derives as well from the ancient Greek agonia, which instead denotes struggle, competition. So it's a feeling of constriction, suffocation, and the struggle to breathe and at the same time, like someone struggling underwater to return to the surface. Or if you will, a struggle for existence in a threatening situation. A threat of what? I believe it is the threat of nonsense, the most serious and destructive threat to human beings. The suspicion that life has no meaning and that therefore living is not worth it. More precisely, therefore, anxiety is the feeling of someone who tries to gain meaning against absurdity. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl called it the feeling of meaninglessness, stressing that the lack of meaning always implies a search for meaning. This is exactly what he teaches us in his bestseller, Man's Search for Meaning, where he tells his experience as a survivor of the Nazi concentration camps during the Second World War. Human beings were capable of resisting and preserving their dignity and personal integrity even in extreme conditions of suffering and deprivation, only if they had a meaning to fight for, someone or something beyond themselves and their current situation. I will come back to this point later. For sure, the search for meaning involves a certain amount of anxiety and at the same time requires a certain ability to endure it and transform it into a creative restlessness. If this happens, then we can use anxiety to make choices, for example. Anxiety makes us responsible and allows us to make decisions. Carl Jaspers said that every decision is a self-decision, and Dr. Frankl adds that every self-decision is a self-configuration, Selbstgestaltung. I quote, "As I configure my destiny, the person I am shapes the character I have. In this way, the personality I become is formed." In short, anxiety delivers us to ourselves as a task to be completed, to be accomplished, and our existence as an open project that, within certain limits, depends on us to define and complete. This, at least, is the desirable outcome of existential anxiety, to invite us to an authentic existence. Therefore, for young people, experiencing anxiety is, up to a certain point, an invaluable opportunity. But it can also become a dramatic impasse. Our culture actually proposes inauthentic models and subtly manipulates desire and imagination to induce us to pursue inauthentic goals. Existence is reduced to a competition to prove that we are up to external standards and expectations of others. Upon closer inspection, it's a form of creeping alienation, disguised but not less dangerous, alienation from ourselves and our own possibilities. This fact makes the struggle for authenticity more difficult and problematic because it is no longer a matter of fighting against an external enemy, like in the student protest movement in the late 60s, for example, but rather of confronting an internal or internalized enemy, which is naturally much more difficult to recognize and defeat. This is why today's young people are less transgressive or rebellious than their predecessors, and yet they feel burning frustrations. Our researches on emotional life of teenagers tell us that alongside anxiety and fear of failure, anger continues to be one of the most prevalent emotions among teenagers. But, in my opinion, that anger is implosive rather than explosive. And in fact, it sometimes comes out through internalizing form of self-harm, social withdrawal, and so on, suicide. In the TV series Adolescence, which caused quite a stir a few months ago, we saw that unrecognized anger and frustration can be the source of deep, hidden distress and sometimes lead to disorderly and violent acting out. But what is most striking in this film is probably the unawareness and inadequacy of adults in front of this phenomenon. Parents and teachers often live side by side with teenagers without even suspecting what is going on in their minds. They scrutinize them without understanding them. They love them without really listening to them. But even in this story, in the end, a possible path to redemption unfolds. When Jamie, the boy who killed his classmate in a fit of rage, decides to admit his guilt and thus take responsibility for himself. But let's turn to anxiety and its possible consequences. Anxiety, said Butulan, narrows the field of vision and blocks the view. It is a kind of clouding, a sense of disorientation, like when you are enveloped in fog and lose sight of external reference points. What is lost is orientation, direction. That's why in German it is called Sinnlosigkeit. This is why I speak of eeriness, Unheimlichkeit, in relation to the experience of the world in anxiety. Anxiety makes the world an alien and inhospitable place where people do not feel at home, or from which sometimes they seek to escape. But despite its immediate psychological meaning, we are dealing here with a broader cultural problem. Vincenzo Costa, one of our most brilliant phenomenologists, has recently published a book on the society of anxiety, where he tells that human society is not simply an organized system of means, roles, and functions in view of shared goals, but it is a machine that produces and distributes emotions. Every social organization presupposes a dominant sentiment, a zeitgeist, and esprit du temps, which represent the framework within which individual and collective existences unfold. This cultural climate in which we are immersed, this atmosphere, surrounds us and pervades us like the air we breathe. It is an atmosphere, precisely. The society of uncertainty is characterized by the experience of precariousness and unpredictability. And this naturally causes anxiety because the inability to predict and control events makes us feel more vulnerable. But there is another reason why our society produces anxiety, and that is that anxiety is productive. Or rather, it causes us to produce continuously in order to appease it. To escape the anxiety of not being good enough, we try to prove our adequacy by chasing productivity and efficiency. Thus, in the society of anxiety, existence has become a continuous performance. And it is precisely the constant concern for our performance that fuels anxiety, as in a vicious circle. From this point of view, school is an eloquent example of how our society works, as school tends to reproduce our society's perverse mechanisms. The school system today is held hostage by over-evaluation, for example. The fact that the education system has essentially become an evaluation system is a consequence of the obsession with measurement that characterizes our times, as Gert Bister told us in a well-known paper several years ago. It is no coincidence that the most common feeling that children say they experience in relation to school is no longer boredom, as it perhaps once was when I went to school, for example. But it is anxiety. And yet, school has not become more demanding than in the past. So the increase in anxiety cannot be attributed to excessive expectations. I think it's the meaning of evaluation that has changed. The issue is that students feel they are being evaluated not for they know or do not know, or for what they do or do not do, but for who they are or can be. For this reason, when we talk about school discomfort, we should remember that it is often a discomfort caused by the school itself sometimes. Furthermore, what is evaluated and measured is the learning of the student, not the teaching of the teachers, usually. And this is another significant limitation. We are more concerned with measuring the adequacy of results than the appropriateness of the means. And I remember Philippe Mérieux, the French educator, saying that the school must be based on the obligation of means, not the obligation of results. From this point of view, school is a perfect reproduction of the social order. Individualistic, perfectionist, competitive. But if we do not change the education system, we will not be able to change the social order. Perhaps we should remember the lesson of Neil Postman, who in the early 80s, if I'm not wrong, argued that schools should play a thermostatic and counter-cyclical role, which means to correct or at least counteract the possible drifts in contemporary societies. But schools can play such a countervailing power only if they do not derive their aims from politics or ideology or from the market, as it happens today, but find their most authentic and timeless aims within the educational process itself. John Dewey already said this more than 100 years ago. But how can we change educational settings so that they become places filled not with paralyzing anxiety, but with creative restlessness and search for meaning? As you may recall, Hannah Arendt spoke of the introduction into the world that we must complete in order to become adults, calling it a second birth. According to Arendt, it is only with word and deed that we insert ourselves into the human world. So I think we should try to regenerate educational places in which teenagers and young adults can experience the responsibility of speaking up and acting together and thinking together, maybe, since thinking is the first deed, as Professor Marion reminded us this morning. Maybe in this way we will be able to give back to the new generations the existential protagonism that rightfully belongs to them and the political quality of their being in the world, which has been fundamentally diffused by the individualistic and narcissistic mood prevalent today. I told that young people have been called the anxious generation. In some ways, it's good that they are, because anxiety is a necessary condition for questioning the meaning or meaninglessness of life, and is ultimately a sign of an authentic existence. But it requires at the same time an education that provides them with the tools, the skills, intellectual, psycho-emotional, moral and spiritual skills to deal with anxiety and use it as a springboard for a full and meaningful life. The anxiety of young people therefore calls into question adults and their educational authority. This is a very delicate point because on closer inspection behind the anxiety of young people, there are often the anxieties of the adults. First of all, their families. In this regard, I find interesting what Jacques Lacan tells in his Seminar 10, speaking of anxiety. Lacan criticizes Heidegger's position, stating that anxiety is not without an object. And the object of anxiety, according to Lacan, is the object too of desire. Something that arises in the relationship with the other. Desire for Lacan is always linked to the desire of the other. So the question is, what do you want from me? Anxiety arises when we do not know what we are to the other, what the other wants from us. In this sense, the title of the latest book by Matteo Lencini, who is an Italian psychologist of adolescence, seems meaningful to me. Be yourself my way, which is obviously a paradoxical message. The invitation to be oneself together with the impossibility of actually becoming oneself is what drives today young people crazy. In my opinion, there are two very obvious problematic trends in the way children are raised in Western society nowadays. Overprotection on one side and overinvestment on the other. On the one hand, children are considered essentially vulnerable and in need of care. But if this concern, which is legitimate to a certain extent, becomes excessive, it ends up making them more fragile or less independent, which is what happens when they grow up normally. Frank Furedi speaks of paranoid parenting, since most parents consider their children to be constantly at risk, when in reality they are safer and healthier than ever in the past. On the other hand, parents are concerned about their children's success. They cannot fall behind. They must succeed at school, in the arts, in sports, in social life, and they absolutely cannot fail, because every failure of their children is experienced as if it were their own. This neurotic double-blind message produces a contradictory effect. I have to succeed, but I am too weak to do so. This is where anxiety comes from. Above all, I find dangerous the mantra we repeat to them from the very first moment they come to light, that there is nothing more important than themselves and their happiness. I think this is a dangerous message, because if I am the most important thing, it's obvious that I will never be able to find anything that can save me from myself, especially at an age when the view on oneself tends to be merciless and the view of others ruthless. Desperately seeking happiness as well as pleasure, success, and so on is the surest way to make oneself unhappy. Happiness and success and so on cannot be searched for their own. And this is a lesson we learned from Max Scheler, first of all. Viktor Frankl, in this regard, argued with Abraham Maslow and his famous pyramid of needs, at the top of which he placed self-actualization. But self-actualization, according to Frankl, is a side effect of self-transcendence, only to the extent that we step outside ourselves and realize a meaning or value beyond ourselves can we feel truly fulfilled. Not per intenzione, but per effectum. This has to do with the very essence of education. It is said that educare is a reinforcement of educere, which is certainly correct. But educere does not simply mean to bring something out of someone, in Socrates' terms, but means rather to bring someone out of themselves, to take someone elsewhere, as Professor Marion told us this morning, and take them towards the world, to discover its meanings and values. This self-transcendence seems to be the most powerful antidote to anxiety. If I am no longer at the center, my existence does not depend from my adequacy or inadequacy anymore. Because what matters is something or someone that lies beyond myself. In this sense, education is nothing more than the continuation of the first act with which we originally brought someone into the world. Education is about ensuring that they explore and learn about that world, and they find reasons to live in it. And that they feel truly at home in it. Because opening up to the world is perhaps the only way to truly know and realize oneself, according to the principle of the ecstatic structure of the consciousness that was spoken about a few minutes ago. Just as Sartre wrote in 1939 on the Nouvelle Revue Française, in a paper on intentionality, Husserl's intentionality. We will not discover ourselves in some hypothetical refuge, but on the street, in the city, in the crowd, as one thing among things, one man among men. Thank you.